They were two single parents sharing one common bond.
When they met, it was perfect timing. They were both working towards a goal.
She was smitten. He swept her off of her feet.
But when gunshots pierce the early morning stillness, their romance is swept into turmoil.
Somebody just got shot in the head out here. Oh my God, holy.
She had one gunshot to her left cheek, one behind her ear, and then another in her forehead. It seemed like overkill.
The homicide investigation will prove that sometimes evil hides in plain sight.
The entire murder was caught on tape.
Police believe she may have been targeted by one of her passengers.
Next thing I know, he gets in the car. Gets into the vehicle. He says what? Drive.
Detectives learn that what initially seems like a job-related fatality is anything but.
I'm noticing that she's uploading inappropriate pictures.
That's like a pretty explicit photo.
Yes, very explicit.
This murder was fueled with anger and rage and distrust.
She's standing next to a white SUV that matches the exact description of the getaway vehicle.
This is a classic case of fatal attraction.
When you hear, "Baby, I love you to death," be wary, because they just might.
October 28th, 2020, Baytown, Texas. It's a quiet night in this quaint Houston suburb.
What people love about Baytown is the community is very close-knit. A lot of people know each other.
It's oil workers. It's everything somebody would think of as far as hardworking, good old USA.
By 5 a.m., one hardworking Baytown resident, Brenda Summers, is up and ready to start the day, but it will soon be hurled into chaos.
Brenda was getting ready for work, and all of a sudden she hears a loud noise resembling a gunshot. When she looked out her window, she witnessed a person being shot in their car.
Oh my God.
She immediately called 911.
911 says it's an emergency. Somebody just got shot in the head out here. Oh my God, he's shot right in the square in the head. Holy. Stay on the phone with me, okay? We're gonna get someone out there.
Within minutes, Baytown police arrive at the apartment complex where Brenda lives on the north side of town.
They're looking at the victim inside the vehicle, consistent with what was reported on 911. Her foot is on the brake. The brake lights are still on. The engine is still running.
It's obvious to them that this person has been shot multiple times.
Police quickly realize they're too late to render first aid.
Unfortunately, there was no pulse. She was already dead.
The first things that homicide detectives want to know at a murder scene is who is their victim.
Obviously, they're trying to figure out some identification, and they look down and they see that the deceased woman has a fanny pack.
When they look inside, they discover a Texas license.
The victim is 31-year-old Jasmine Garrett.
Once you know as a homicide detective who your victim is, you can start conducting what's called the psychological autopsy. Who is this? This is not just a body in front of us. This is a person.
Born and raised in Indiana, Jasmine Garrett always had an affinity for the arts.
Jasmine had such a creative mind. It didn't matter if it was arts, writing, that's how she expressed herself.
She loved to read, she loved to paint, and people gravitated towards her because of that free spirit.
Jasmine's the type of person that dreams big and has a big heart. Some people may say a hopeless romantic.
Jasmine was eager to see what the world outside her Indiana hometown had to offer.
She made a huge decision to move to a big city, and that city was Houston, Texas.
Growing up in a small town, the lure of the big city can seem very enticing.
And shortly after moving to Houston, Jasmine found love with a man named Calvin Ray.
Calvin was another free spirit just like Jasmine, and they really connected over their love of adventure.
But in 2018, the couple got some unexpected news that would change their life forever. Jasmine was pregnant with twins.
One newborn is a lot, but two are overwhelming. So Calvin and Jasmine really struggled to stay afloat.
And things became even more challenging when Jasmine lost the help of her partner.
Jasmine's boyfriend and the father of her two twins got into some legal trouble, unfortunately, and was sent to jail.
Jasmine was already facing the challenges that come with being a new mother, but now her partner has become locked up.
She really needed some help.
So Jasmine reluctantly sent the twins to live with family members in Indiana, while she worked to create a stable environment for them in Houston.
She was making decisions that would help benefit them in the long run.
Jasmine was on her grind. Her main focus was affording an apartment and getting her children back.
She's working 12-hour days as a driver with rideshare companies to save up money so she can get an apartment of her own and have a place where her children can come to.
The last thing on Jasmine's mind was finding romance. But one night on the job, romance found her.
She picks up a handsome passenger named Robert Roberts.
Robert?
Yeah, Jasmine?
That's me.
Okay. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you last night?
It's better now.
She was smitten. He was congenial. He was funny. He swept her off of her feet.
He had a personality that was outgoing and fun.
Actually, you mind if I move up front?
Oh, no problem. Go for it.
All right.
Like Jasmine, Robert was a single parent, working hard to provide for his kids.
These two right here is yours?
Yeah, those are my babies.
I actually, I got two of my own. That's them right there.
Robert is a young father taking care of his children. And that said to Jasmine that he's a provider, he's a protector.
Before long, the two were inseparable.
They were so wooed by one another. They had already started planning to create this life with one another.
They ended up leaning on each other. They became each other's person.
So how did Jasmine end up shot to death in the Houston suburb of Baytown?
She had one gunshot to her left cheek, one behind her ear, and then another in her forehead. It seemed like overkill.
Homicide detectives look for things that are out of the ordinary, disorganized. What is it about this scene that is telling the story?
They see a sign on her dashboard that indicates she's a car share driver,
which provides investigators with their first lead.
Was Jasmine picking someone up at this apartment complex?
Police believe she may have been targeted by one of her passengers.
In October of 2020, single mom Jasmine Garrett was on the grind.
She gets with a rideshare company, starts making money that way.
Jasmine was working 12 hours a day so that she could save enough money to get her own apartment, get her children back.
Jasmine was determined. She was going to make something of her life.
And when she picked up a charming passenger, Robert Roberts, she thought she'd found a kindred spirit.
The two of them were forging a very tight relationship, providing each other the support that they needed in order to be successful.
But now Jasmine has been found shot to death at an apartment complex in the Houston suburb of Baytown.
Crimes such as this you really don't see very often in Baytown, Texas. They are trying to figure out what in the world just happened.
Investigators immediately noticed that her rideshare sign is lit up.
They also noticed that her cell phone was missing. And so the police ascertained that this could have been a robbery by one of her potential passengers. there was stippling present on the gunshot wounds, which means she was shot at very close range.
It is clear that this person didn't just fire a weapon at Jasmine. They were right on her. They were perhaps within inches of her head when they fired this gun.
These shots were all intentional, close range, and that tells us that the gunman was not taking any chances of Jasmine surviving. He wanted to make sure this person was dead.
Inside Jasmine's car and on the ground around it, investigators locate 3 .40 caliber shell casings.
So now, you know that Jasmine was shot with a .40 caliber pistol.
The casings were bagged as evidence and sent off for ballistic testing. Police hope they'll eventually be able to match them to a murder weapon.
Investigators also collect a parking pass hanging from Jasmine's rearview mirror.
It looks similar to parking passes hanging in other surrounding vehicles.
Detectives take that parking pass with the intentions of providing it to the apartment staff to see if they can verify if she is a tenant.
But first, they want to speak to their eyewitness, the woman who called 911, Brenda Summers.
At this point, she's the only one who saw what happened.
Miss Summers, can you tell us everything that you remember?
Of course. I was getting ready for work.
Brenda reiterates what she told dispatch on the 911 call, that around 5 a.m., she heard 2 loud bangs outside her apartment.
Brenda says that as she looks outside, she can see a man standing outside the driver's door of Jasmine's car.
She describes the killer as being a black male, about 5'9", wearing a white t-shirt and a red beanie hat.
He's also wearing a white medical mask.
I saw him shoot her square in the forehead, and then he ran.
She says he ran off to a wooded area, and that's when she called 911.
Oh my God, he shot right square in the head. Holy.
Do you recognize either of them from the apartment complex?
No, never saw them before.
Although Ms. Summers' description of the assailant is helpful, the detectives know they need more.
Thank you for your time, Miss Summers.
So they immediately go to the leasing office to speak with the manager to inquire as to whether or not the apartment complex has surveillance videos.
Can you pull up the footage around 4 a.m.?
Yes. The apartment complex has great security footage, and so they sit down and they begin to watch what unfolded.
At 4 a.m., detectives see a man matching the description given by Brenda Summers enter the apartment complex.
He's just lurking in the shadows, back and forth in front of this one particular apartment building.
Then at 4:52, detectives can see Jasmine exit one of the apartment buildings and walk directly towards her car in the parking lot.
The suspect hangs back a little bit. He waits until after she gets into her car before he approaches her vehicle.
They engage in what appears to be a heated discussion for several minutes.
And detectives already know what happens next.
The masked man fires into the car 3 times.
Jasmine's entire murder was caught on tape.
But in reviewing more of the surveillance footage, detectives noticed that the killer didn't run into the nearby woods like Brenda Summers thought.
After shooting Jasmine, he ran back to a white SUV, and the vehicle speeds immediately out of the apartment complex.
Who's driving the SUV?
Within hours of Jasmine Garrett's murder, police have discovered surveillance footage that shows the entire shooting go down. But several questions still remain.
Who is the masked man who shot her? And who is driving the white SUV that drove him from the scene?
When they roll back the footage, detectives see the white SUV arriving at the apartment complex just after 4 a.m.
So they're pretty confident the killer wasn't a resident of the apartment complex or someone Jasmine was picking up a part of a rideshare.
This murder was not a random robbery. Whoever killed Jasmine had her as a personal target.
This killing was planned and premeditated.
Unfortunately, though, detectives can't make out the getaway vehicle's license plate.
Can you zoom in more than that?
Unfortunately not.
Investigators are very frustrated during this time. It's almost too good to be true. It's not every day that a murder takes place that you can see it on footage, but you're missing so much information.
In hopes of trying to get more information about that white SUV, detectives assemble a group of foot patrol officers to kind of canvass the area.
Okay, let me know as soon as you find anything.
With that search underway, detectives have more questions for the manager of the apartment complex.
Detectives were not sure as to why Jasmine was in the apartment complex in the first place. They didn't know whether or not she was there to drop off or pick up a passenger, or if she actually lived there and was about to start work that morning.
Now, after looking at the surveillance video and seeing Jasmine exit one of the apartments, their belief is she possibly lived there.
Found this in the car.
Investigators hand over to the staff the parking pass that was found in Jasmine's car.
That's one of my passes.
However, it's not a resident parking pass.
The apartment management said, that's a visitor pass. That's not what the residents have.
Do you have records of tenants and visitors?
Yeah, let me look.
They were able to track down who provided that visitor pass.
The pass is linked to an apartment being leased by a man named Joel Pratt.
They make contact with Joel and bring him into the station for an official interview.
Listen, appreciate you coming in. I'm sorry we have to meet like this, all right? But we do need to sit down and see if we can help us out. And we'll sort of go over everything again, all right? So, what do you know her as? What's her name? What do you call her?
Jasmine.
Jazzy?
Mm-hmm. Her name is Jasmine Garrett.
Joel says he and Jasmine became fast friends after she moved to the Houston area in 2016.
It was completely platonic. Joel is a gay man.
And when money got tight for Jasmine after the birth of her twins and their father's incarceration, Joel was there to help.
She asked Joel if she could crash on his couch for a while, and he agreed. Joel provided that safety net for her as she was getting her finances back on track. He gave her a place to stay.
You talk to her throughout the day of your stay, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is that common? Y'all talk, text, phone call, whatever?
Talk, text.
While she's out working. Everything seems to be fine?
Joel remembers the evening before that Jasmine had come home pretty late, and she appeared to be really tired from working a 12-hour shift.
Hey.
Tired.
Long day, huh?
Very long day.
And they spoke for a little while, telling him about their day.
And then she crashed on the couch.
She seemed perfectly fine.
She was tired.
Didn't indicate any issues going on that day. Or just seemed like a normal driving around doing her business day.
It was just like a real big problem or something like this. She would have let me know.
The detectives have no reason to doubt Joel's story, and he doesn't appear to resemble the shooter in the surveillance footage.
They can easily rule him out as the person who killed Jasmine.
But they have to wonder, does he have any idea who did?
They ask him if he knows anybody who would want to harm Jasmine Garrett.
To detectives' surprise, Joel has an answer right away.
Joel tells detectives that she had been involved in an on and off again relationship.
They had the problems. They were going through it and everything like that. She would tell me about it. She would tell me everything, but she told me about it.
Who's this guy?
Albert Roberts.
He goes on to tell detectives that while he's never met Robert, the stories Jasmine shared were concerning.
Like she was just throwing stuff and she's like, I gotta get out of here. She was scared.
Texas police investigating the homicide of Jasmine Garrett have discovered she was living with a friend named Joel Pratt at the time of her murder. Now in an interview room, Joel has named a possible suspect.
Apparently, Jasmine was in an on and off again tumultuous relationship.
Who's this guy? Albert Roberts?
Joel never actually met Robert Roberts in person. He had only heard about Robert from the stories that Jasmine told him, and those stories were pretty horrific.
Him and her had some problems earlier this year, and they got into an argument.
Joel told detectives this one, just bizarre story involving Robert and Jasmine.
She had to go up. Her parents are up in Indiana. Okay. They have kids.
Joel tells detectives that the last time Jasmine went to Indiana to visit her family, Robert went with her.
They were already having problems, but they were on and off. He didn't want nobody else on with her, so he went with her.
Robert had this desire that he had to control her. He had to control every aspect of her life.
On the drive back, Jasmine pulled over to get gas in Little Rock, Arkansas, when a stranger walked up behind her.
Jasmine was inappropriately approached by a man.
Or some dude had touched her or something, rubbed her finger up her back, and then she turned around thinking it was the guy she was with. The dude told her, "I'm sorry, I just wanted to see your face," and she told me, "You don't need to touch people like that."
Robert sees this, but instead of running to her aid, he actually assaults her.
Hey! What the hell you doing talking to another man, huh?
To me, Robert.
He slapped her upside the head and told her, "Slap her?" Yes, hit her upside the head and told her, "Don't talk to anybody else." Then he got tussling.
Now, you think he would grab the man, this stranger? No, he attacked Jasmine, slapped her right there, right in front of everyone.
Good luck on your own.
Joel says Robert took off in the car, abandoning Jasmine at the gas station.
He takes off in her vehicle?
No, it was a rental at the time.
Whatever rental.
Left her there at the store.
She was left with no money and no means to get back. She really had to try to figure things out.
She ended up calling Joel.
Joel, I need your help.
Joel Pratt is able to drive to Little Rock, Arkansas, and pick her up.
Jazzy, let me see. Jazzy, this is crazy.
I know. I'm so done with him. I swear I'm done after this.
But Robert wasn't done terrorizing Jasmine.
What is it?
Oh my God.
Roberts has hacked into her social media accounts and has began to post sexually explicit pictures of her.
They were pretty explicit photos.
Yes, very explicit. Jasmine does not upload pictures like that. These were inappropriate pictures. Like, real inappropriate. One of those things that get you blocked off Facebook, like, in an instant.
I'm so sorry, Jazz. Look, let's just go home and we'll take care of that later, okay?
Okay, it's so embarrassing.
Joel says when they got back to Houston, Jasmine took legal action against Robert.
She made a report about that in Houston?
Yeah, she made a report. She had a big knot right here and it had stitches in it, and then she had a stitch on her lips. She looked like a fish for like 3 days.
The domestic violence case against Robert was still pending, but Jasmine was relieved to have him out of her life.
However, Jasmine's relief was short-lived.
It was a short period where she had begun to relax. But then one day, Joel says that he came home and he found Jasmine frantically packing her bags.
I walked around the corner and said, "Hey, Jazz, you all right?" She thought I gotta get out of here. What happened?
I gotta go. It's not safe for me here anymore.
She saw Robert and he had a gun.
She walked up the walkway and he came around the corner and put a gun in her face. Told me next time we see you, he's gonna kill her.
She said why? What was the issue?
So the guy was angry.
Better watch your back. Your days are numbered.
Thank you for everything.
You don't have to leave. You'll be safe here. Please don't go.
Jasmine was so scared that she moved out of Joel's apartment and started staying in motels.
Unfortunately, Jasmine could not keep up the financial commitment that it took to stay in different hotel rooms every night. So eventually she leaned on her friend Joel again and moved back in with him.
Moved all her stuff out of there, and she came stable.
She moved back in with Joel about a week prior to the shooting.
The investigators are stunned by everything they're hearing. And if it's true, they agree that Robert is their #1 suspect in this crime.
Anything else you can think of? Here's my card with my information on it. All right. What I want you to do when I get you back there, I want you to see what you can find out of this cat. Okay?
When detectives run Robert's name into their database, they discover that Jasmine had indeed filed police reports against Robert for attacking her.
Robert also looks eerily similar to the man from the surveillance footage.
Detectives are eager to speak with Robert Roberts, but locating him is no easy task.
He's not answering phone calls. He's not showing up to any of the previous addresses that police have on file for him.
As officers continue patrolling the area for Robert, detectives do some additional digging on the white SUV that served as Robert's getaway vehicle on the morning of the crime.
They determined it's unlikely that the vehicle belonged to Robert.
When reviewing the DMV records, they noticed that he drives a black sedan and not a white SUV as seen in the surveillance video.
They're digging around looking for any sign of that white SUV.
And when investigators dig into Robert's social media page, they find just what they're looking for.
The detectives find a profile picture of one of Robert's friends standing next to a white SUV that matches the exact description of the getaway vehicle.
The woman's name is Candace Oliver.
How was she involved in this? Did she want Robert all to herself?
She could help plot this whole thing.
With a history of abuse exposed, Jasmine Garrett's ex-boyfriend, Robert Roberts, has become the prime suspect in her homicide investigation. But police believe he had a willing accomplice.
Someone driving a white SUV was Robert's getaway driver on the morning of the crime.
They were able to find the identity of the person who owns the white SUV. Her name is Candace Oliver.
Investigators are having difficulties tracking down Robert. So in the meantime, they shift their focus to Candace.
Police bring Candace back to the Baytown police station for questioning.
They immediately press her about her relationship with Robert Roberts.
I met him through a friend, though, y'all. This was years ago. I guess he kept going around, you know?
Candace shared with detectives that, yeah, she knew Robert Roberts and that they used to date on and off, but now their relationship kind of grew more to a platonic relationship, more of a brother-sister type relationship.
Detectives ask Candace about the last time she saw Robert. She tells them it was on October 28th, the same night of Jasmine's murder.
So October 28th, which was a Wednesday, shows up at your house, correct?
Right.
You remember about what time it was around?
It was about 2 something.
So maybe 2 in the morning.
Yeah.
What are you doing here?
Look, I need you to do me a favor.
Robert asks her, I need you to drive me somewhere.
Oh, Robert, it's 2 a.m.
Please.
So he never called you ahead of time, text you, message you, anything about, hey, what's going on? Can I come out? I want to come out or anything like that. Nothing like that. Just showed up.
Yes. It was really shocking because I haven't seen him for a minute. And he was like, yeah, take me somewhere. I was like, where I take you?
You owe me after this. Where are we going?
I'll explain to you on the way. But come on, we gotta hurry.
You asked him, where do you want me to take? What do you tell you?
He said, just drive.
Once in the car, Candace says Robert began directing her towards Baytown.
It was a quiet ride.
Did he tell you where to go?
No, he just said, go here.
All right, so what do you mean, go here? Did he give you like a location to drive to? You put in your phone like directions? Or did he say, go here, here, here?
He just said, here and up.
Candace told detectives that she continuously asked Robert, what's going on, where are we going, why are we going, but Robert refused to tell her and just only simply stated, just keep driving.
You're not even asking, well, we going out here? Who you took to see?
I kept asking him that the whole time. He was not trying to give me any answers.
The drive from Spring to Baytown, or really the west end of Houston to the far east end of Houston, can take anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour. It's a long time to be in a car with somebody and not know your destination.
Candace says they eventually arrived at a Baytown apartment complex.
I just parked. I cut my car off. And I just sat in the car.
And what did he do while he's there?
He got out the car.
Candace says she never saw Robert with a gun.
He gets out. He's got nothing with him.
No.
In other words, he's not carrying anything.
That's what I'm kind of shocked.
Gets out and starts walking around. Or walks away from the vehicle.
Right.
Okay.
And it was so dark I didn't see him anymore.
When detectives asked Candace what it is she thought Robert was there to do, she says she's unsure, but figures he was there to see another woman.
He probably got women all over, you know what I mean? It ain't no man you gonna listen. My mama would say anything that's open at 12 and above is nothing but legs. I'm a woman, so in the back of my mind, what woman you want to see now?
Candace does tell detectives that in the past, Robert had mentioned a young lady by the name of Jazz, but that she had never met her personally. After waiting for about 10 or 15 minutes, Candace began to call Robert to inquire as to what's going on.
I had called and said, what's going on? Son of a, what are you doing? You know what I mean?
What does he say?
He hung up the phone.
About 30 minutes later, Robert finally returned.
Okay. When he got back to the vehicle, was he just walking, running, jogging?
He was walking.
He's walking. Everything seemed normal.
Yes.
She says he didn't seem nervous or suspicious at all.
Next time he gets in the car, we leave.
Gets into the vehicle. Says what?
Drive.
Candace says he didn't say anything about who he came to see or what he was there to do.
Candace tells detectives that she never saw Robert with the gun, nor did she hear any gunshots while she was waiting for him to come back to the vehicle.
Her story is certainly suspicious. It's possible that she knows more about what happened than she's letting on.
In an attempt to encourage Candace to be more forthcoming, they decide to show her the crime scene photos from Jasmine's murder.
This is what we were. That's what he did. That's what he did. That's why we're at this point right now. That's Jazz.
Guess who drove him to the crime scene? And drove him away from a crime scene? Exactly. Guess who's involved in it? Yes, ma'am.
Despite her loyalty to Robert, she agrees to go on record that the man in the footage is Robert Roberts.
This is him.
That looks like him, yeah.
But where is Robert now?
They have their case. They just don't have him.
Police in Baytown, Texas finally have enough to arrest Robert Roberts for the murder of his ex-girlfriend, Jasmine Garrett. His reluctant getaway driver, Candace Oliver, has positively identified him as the shooter in surveillance footage.
This is him.
That looks like him, yeah.
While the evidence seems to be ironclad and squarely pointing at Robert as the shooter, there's one issue. They still don't know where Robert is.
Candace said she hadn't heard from him since the night in question.
They have him at the location. They have him in the vehicle. They have him captured on tape. They have their case. They just don't have him.
Weeks go by without any sign of Robert until April 13th, 2021.
Baytown police get a tip that Robert is hiding out over 300 miles away in New Orleans. With the help of New Orleans police, they're able to arrest him without incident and extradite him back to Texas.
They're hoping that they're going to get a confession out of him.
Mr. Roberts, I'm Detective Zukas, Detective Gonzalez, Baytown Police Department. Let's sit down and speak with you for a minute.
But Robert refuses to give a statement, let alone a confession.
Okay.
Robert asserts his right to have a lawyer present, effectively terminating the interview.
I'll talk to you guys when I have my lawyer for you. Anything you want to know when I have my lawyer. Okay. So you don't want to talk to you locate or speak with your attorney, correct? My name, buddy.
Regardless, investigators have what they need to charge Robert with first-degree murder.
They don't have Robert's confession. They don't need it. They're convinced that they have enough evidence and enough information to convict Robert Roberts of this horrible murder.
And when his trial begins in September 2023, prosecutors present their theory.
They have the story to tell of Jasmine and Robert. Started off as two people who leaned on each other, who cared about each other, but also a story of rage and envy, a story of domestic violence, a story of abuse.
The next time I see you, I'm gonna kill you.
Once Jasmine found out about Robert's true colors, she did everything she could to leave him, even filing domestic violence charges.
The prosecution's theory is that Robert couldn't get over it.
Prosecutors believe that Robert was fueled by anger and distress and that he had to control Jasmine.
He knew that she had filed domestic violence charges against him, and he knew that was the ultimate sign that he was losing control over her.
Prosecutors argued that Roberts would do anything to control Jasmine, including taking her life. And on the evening of October 28, 2020, that's exactly what he did.
Prosecutors say that night Robert drove to the home of his friend, Candace Oliver, and asked her for a ride.
I need you to do me a favor.
They claim this was a careful calculation to avoid his own vehicle being seen at the place of the crime.
I'll be right back.
He waited and lurked outside in the shadows. He waited for his opportunity to trap Jasmine in the confines of her vehicle.
The fact that he was able to wait for her to come out shows that this wasn't only a crime of passion, it was premeditated and it was planned.
As she was getting into her car, Roberts revealed himself and confronted her.
Hey, yo, Jazz, we need to talk.
Robert, what are you doing here? So you really thought the police was gonna help you, huh?
Robert shot her 3 times in cold blood, killing her instantly.
For some reason, he took her phone. Investigators aren't entirely sure as to why.
Oh my God, he shot that square in the head. Holy.
While a neighbor called 911, Robert fled back to Candace's SUV and returned to her place in Springfield.
If it had not been for the surveillance video, Robert may have gotten away with this.
After a 5-day trial, the jury retires to deliberate.
After hearing all the horrific facts of this case, it didn't take long for them to come back with a verdict.
Robert Roberts is found guilty of first-degree murder and is sentenced to life in prison.
He won't be eligible for parole until April of 2051.
Candace was never charged in connection to the crime due to her cooperation with police and the fact that she truly seemed clueless as to what was going to happen that night.
This is a classic case of fatal attraction. And no matter how hard she tried to get away from Roberts, he was so fatally attracted to Jasmine that he was not gonna stop until he took her life.
This was an individual who, in a premeditated and cold-blooded fashion, sought out a person that he just couldn't let go of.
Though someone may present charming and loving and caring, we have to pay attention to the first sign of abuse. It's important to leave because it won't change.
Domestic violence happens in cycles, and we oftentimes want women Men, who's ever involved in a violent situation, why don't they just get away? Why don't they just get help? Jasmine tried. If you're involved in a domestic violence type of situation, get help. And when you hear, "Baby, I love you to death," be wary of that statement, because they just might.
The rain had already washed away most of the tire tracks by the time investigators realized they were dealing with something far more terrifying than a missing person report. Somewhere between British Columbia and rural Washington state, two teenagers who had crossed an international border for what should have been an ordinary weekend shopping trip had vanished into silence. No ransom demand, no desperate phone call, no witnesses who could explain where they had gone. Just an abandoned van, scattered clues that refused to fit together, and a mystery that would haunt detectives for more than 4 decades. The killer believed time would bury every mistake. He believed the forests of the Pacific Northwest would keep his secret forever. He was wrong. 45 years later, a microscopic strand of DNA hidden in forgotten evidence would accomplish what thousands of interviews, countless investigative hours, and generations of detectives could not. But in November 1987, none of that was imaginable. Back then, all anyone knew was that Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had disappeared without a trace. Jay Cook was 20 years old. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18. They lived in Saanich, a municipality on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. Friends described them as a young couple with ordinary dreams and ordinary plans. They were excited about their future, enjoying the freedom that comes with early adulthood, the stage of life where every weekend seems to promise another adventure. Their families never imagined that one short trip across the border would become the last time they would ever see them alive. The journey itself sounded completely routine. On the weekend of November 18th, SIL 1987, the couple planned to drive from Vancouver Island into Washington State. They intended to pick up furnace parts for J.S. father, who operated a heating business. The trip was practical rather than glamorous. They would travel by ferry, drive south through Washington, collect the parts, spend some time shopping, and return home. Thousands of Canadians made similar trips every year. Nothing about their plans suggested danger. They crossed into the United States carrying little more than travel essentials and expectations of returning within days. Family members expected phone calls. Friends expected stories from the trip. Instead, the silence began almost immediately. When Jay and Tanya failed to return as planned, concern grew quickly. At first, there was hope that they had simply encountered travel delays or mechanical trouble. But as hours became days, those explanations became harder to believe. Their disappearance crossed an international border, complicating the search from the very beginning. Canadian authorities and law enforcement agencies in Washington state suddenly faced a case with 2 missing young adults whose last confirmed movements stretched across multiple jurisdictions. Then came the first devastating discovery. On November 24th, SIL 1987, 6 days after the couple disappeared, a road maintenance worker noticed the body of a young woman in a ditch near rural Alger, Washington, in Skagit County. She had been left in an isolated area far from busy highways and far from the people searching for her. Investigators soon identified her as Tanya Van Cuylenborg. The crime scene immediately told detectives this was no accidental death. Tanya had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. She had been shot once in the back of the head with a .380 caliber handgun. Her hands had been bound with plastic zip ties. Her clothing and personal belongings became crucial evidence as forensic investigators carefully documented every detail the scene could provide. Every fiber, every fingerprint, every biological trace was collected with painstaking attention. In 1987, no one knew that one of those microscopic traces would eventually become the key to identifying her killer decades later. But investigators still had another terrifying question. Where was Jay? The discovery of Tanya's body transformed the investigation. Detectives no longer searched for 2 missing travelers. They searched for one murder victim and one missing man who might still be alive or who might already have suffered the same fate. The search expanded across western Washington. Officers checked wooded areas, abandoned roads, rivers, and isolated clearings. Tips poured in from both sides of the Canadian border. Every possible sighting had to be investigated. Every rumor had to be tested. Families waited beside telephones, hoping for news that somehow contradicted the horror already unfolding. 2 days later, on November 26th, another grim discovery ended that hope forever. A hunter walking through woods near Monroe, Washington, in Snohomish County, found the body of a young man hidden in a remote area. Investigators identified him as Jay Cook. The circumstances surrounding his death were different from Tanya's, but no less brutal. Jay had been strangled with ligatures. He had suffered severe blunt force injuries to his head. His hands had also been restrained with plastic zip ties, immediately linking the two murders. Detectives knew they were looking for the same offender or offenders. Whoever committed these crimes had separated the victims, killed them in different locations, and abandoned their bodies miles apart in an apparent attempt to complicate the investigation. As crime scene specialists examined both locations, another mystery emerged. Where was the van? The couple had been traveling in a bronze 1977 Ford Club wagon van. It had become one of the largest missing pieces in the investigation. Detectives believed it could contain fingerprints, fibers, blood evidence, or some overlooked clue explaining what had happened between the moment Jay and Tanya crossed into Washington and the moment their bodies were abandoned in two different counties. The answer came the following day. On November 27th, the van was located in a parking lot in Bellingham, Washington, outside a business. At first glance, it looked almost ordinary. It had not been burned. It had not been pushed into a river or hidden deep in the forest. It had simply been abandoned, as though someone hoped it would blend into everyday life long enough for memories to fade. For investigators, the van became a mobile crime scene. Inside, they found evidence showing that the journey had not unfolded as planned. Some of the furnace parts the couple intended to collect were still inside, confirming they had completed at least part of their errand. Personal belongings remained. Detectives carefully photographed, cataloged, and preserved everything that might someday explain the final hours of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Among the evidence collected were biological samples from Tanya's clothing that suggested the presence of an unknown male. In 1987, forensic scientists were only beginning to understand the future potential of DNA analysis. The samples were preserved according to the best standards available at the time. No one could know that this invisible evidence would outlive retired detectives, changing technologies, and decades of frustration. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they realized how little they truly knew. They could estimate where the couple had traveled. They knew where the bodies had been found. They knew where the van had been abandoned. But the crucial hours in between remained a complete mystery. Who approached Jay and Tanya? Was it someone they met by chance? Were they targeted randomly? Or had someone been watching them long before they disappeared into the forests of Washington? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. And as winter settled over the Pacific Northwest, detectives faced a chilling realization. The killer had vanished without leaving a name. But somewhere inside the evidence sealed into police storage, a secret had survived, waiting for science to become powerful enough to hear it. The discovery of two bodies and an abandoned van transformed a missing person investigation into one of the Pacific Northwest's most perplexing homicide cases. Detectives from multiple agencies suddenly faced a crime that crossed county lines, crossed an international border, and contained almost no obvious path toward the person responsible. Jay Cook had been found in a wooded area near Monroe in Snohomish County. Tanya Van Cuylenborg had been found in a ditch near Alger in Skagit County. Their van had been abandoned in Bellingham, in Whatcom County. Every location added another layer of complexity. Every mile between those scenes represented time investigators could not account for and opportunities the killer had used to disappear. The investigation quickly became a cooperative effort involving numerous law enforcement agencies in Washington state, working alongside Canadian authorities. Detectives on both sides of the border understood that Jay and Tanya had left British Columbia with ordinary plans and had no documented reason to disappear voluntarily. Their families, friends, employers, and acquaintances were interviewed in detail. Investigators searched for anything that might suggest they had arranged to meet someone or had become involved in a dispute before leaving Canada. Nothing credible emerged that pointed in that direction. Attention turned instead to reconstructing the couple's movements after they entered the United States. Investigators confirmed that the purpose of the trip had been legitimate. Jay and Tanya had traveled to obtain furnace parts for Jay's father's heating business. Evidence recovered from the van supported that account, indicating that they had successfully collected at least some of the parts they intended to purchase. That detail narrowed one important question. Whatever happened to them occurred after they had carried out at least part of the reason for making the journey. Detectives painstakingly assembled a timeline using receipts, witness interviews, and physical evidence. Every confirmed sighting mattered. Every documented stop became another marker in the final known hours of the couple's lives. But despite extensive efforts, significant gaps remained. Those missing hours would become one of the defining frustrations of the investigation. The crime scenes themselves revealed important facts without revealing the identity of the offender. Tanya had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. The assault meant investigators were able to recover biological evidence that would be carefully preserved. In 1987, DNA profiling was still in its early years. While the scientific community already recognized its potential, routine forensic applications were limited compared with what would become possible decades later. Nevertheless, crime scene technicians followed established procedures and preserved the evidence with extraordinary care, understanding that even if current technology could not answer every question, future advances might. That decision would eventually prove invaluable. Jay's death presented investigators with a different set of forensic findings. He had suffered blunt force injuries and had been strangled. Like Tanya, his hands had been restrained with plastic zip ties. The matching restraints strongly suggested that both victims had been controlled by the same offender or offenders during the crime. Detectives believed the murders were connected beyond any reasonable doubt. The zip ties themselves became an important focus. Investigators attempted to determine whether they could be traced to a particular manufacturer or retailer. At the time, however, plastic cable ties were widely available through hardware stores, automotive suppliers, and industrial distributors. They were useful, inexpensive products with countless legitimate purposes. Nothing about the restraints immediately identified who had purchased them. The firearm used to kill Tanya offered another potential lead. Forensic examination established that she had been shot with a .380 caliber handgun. Detectives searched for matching ballistic evidence and investigated whether similar weapons had been connected to other crimes in the region. They explored the possibility that the murders could be linked to another offender operating in Washington during the late 1980s. Despite those efforts, no definitive connection could be established. As news of the murders spread, tips began arriving from across Washington and British Columbia. Some callers believed they had seen the couple during their trip. Others reported suspicious individuals or vehicles. Investigators examined each lead carefully, aware that even a seemingly insignificant observation could become the breakthrough they needed. Thousands of hours were devoted to interviewing witnesses, checking alibis, reviewing travel routes, and following information provided by members of the public. Detectives retraced highways between Bellingham, Mount Vernon, Monroe, and other locations connected to the investigation. They attempted to identify anyone who might have encountered Jay and Tanya during the final days of their journey. But as weeks turned into months, certainty remained elusive. The absence of a clear suspect made the investigation especially difficult. There was no documented relationship between the victims and an obvious offender. No credible witness could identify the person responsible. No confession arrived. The available forensic evidence could establish important facts about the crime, but it could not yet attach a name to the unknown male whose biological material had been recovered. Investigators refused to abandon the case. The files continued to grow. Photographs, laboratory reports, witness statements, maps, forensic analyses, and investigative notes filled boxes. Detectives documented every lead, even when it appeared to reach a dead end. Experienced investigators understood that unsolved cases sometimes change years later when old information is viewed through a new perspective. The families of Jay and Tanya continued searching for answers of their own. They spoke with investigators, cooperated fully with the inquiry, and lived through the difficult reality faced by many families connected to unsolved homicides. They knew who the victims were. They knew where the bodies had been found, but they did not know why the crime had happened or who was responsible. As the years passed, the investigation remained active, Though progress became increasingly limited, detectives retired. New investigators inherited the files. Each new generation reviewed the evidence, hoping to notice something earlier investigators had overlooked. The preserved biological evidence remained one of the most important pieces of the case. Advances in forensic DNA analysis during the 1990s allowed laboratories to develop increasingly detailed genetic profiles. The unknown male DNA recovered during the investigation was analyzed using improving scientific techniques, and a profile suitable for comparison was eventually developed. Detectives entered that profile into available law enforcement databases, hoping it would match someone whose DNA had already been collected through the criminal justice system. No match appeared. The unknown profile belonged to someone who was not in the database. Once again, the investigation reached another barrier. Yet this barrier differed from earlier ones in one crucial respect. Investigators now possessed something they had never had before: a reliable DNA profile from the offender. They still did not know his identity. They still did not know his name. But they knew that if his DNA ever entered the system through a qualifying criminal case, science might finally reveal who he was. The years continued to pass. Cold case detectives maintained the files. Forensic laboratories preserved the evidence. The families continued waiting. The man responsible, whoever he was, remained unidentified. To the outside world, it appeared that the trail had gone cold. Inside the evidence room, however, the most important witness in the entire investigation had never stopped waiting. It was silent. It had no face. It could not speak. But hidden within that preserved DNA profile was the identity of a killer who still believed that time had erased every trace he had left behind. The investigation entered the 1990s carrying the weight that defines every true cold case. The crime scenes had been meticulously documented. The physical evidence had been preserved. Thousands of investigative hours had been invested. Detectives had interviewed witnesses, followed tips, reconstructed travel routes, and examined every plausible lead they could verify. Yet the central question remained exactly as it had been in November 1987. Who killed Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg? The passage of time altered many things, but it did not alter the determination of investigators. Cold cases rarely remain frozen in the way the public imagines. Files are reviewed. New information is evaluated. Advances in forensic science create opportunities that did not exist when the crimes were first committed. Detectives retire, but the investigations themselves continue, handed from one generation of investigators to another. That became the story of the Cook and Van Cuylenborg murders. The original detectives gradually passed the investigation to newer investigators, each inheriting not only boxes of reports and photographs, but also the responsibility to continue searching for answers. Every new detective began in much the same way, reading every report from the beginning, studying every photograph, examining every laboratory finding, and questioning every assumption that had guided the investigation years earlier. One principle remained constant. Nothing could be taken for granted. Every piece of evidence had to be considered again. Every witness statement deserved another review. Every timeline had to be tested against the facts. By this point, forensic science had begun changing criminal investigations across North America. DNA profiling had become increasingly reliable, and law enforcement agencies were solving cases that had once seemed impossible. Crimes committed years earlier suddenly produced arrests because biological evidence preserved from the original investigations could now identify offenders with extraordinary precision. The Cook Van Cuylenborg case seemed like a candidate for that same breakthrough. Investigators possessed biological evidence recovered during the original investigation, including DNA from an unknown male associated with Tanya Van Cuylenborg's murder. Scientists had successfully developed a DNA profile from that evidence. It represented the strongest forensic lead in the case. The profile was entered into law enforcement databases. Investigators waited. No match appeared. That result was disappointing, but not entirely unexpected. The national DNA databases depended upon comparison samples. If an offender had never been required to provide DNA through the criminal justice system, there would be nothing available for comparison. The absence of a match did not weaken the evidence. It simply meant the person responsible remained unidentified. The investigation continued through conventional methods. Detectives revisited persons of interest from the original inquiry. Individuals who had attracted attention years earlier were reconsidered using updated forensic results. Alibis were reviewed. Statements were compared again. Where possible, biological samples were obtained from people whose names had surfaced during the investigation. Those comparisons excluded individuals rather than identifying the offender. Each exclusion narrowed the field. Each exclusion also reinforced the reliability of the DNA evidence. The unknown profile belonged to someone else. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, investigators also examined whether the murders might be connected to other violent crimes committed in the Pacific Northwest. Washington State had experienced several notorious homicide investigations during that era, and detectives routinely explored the possibility that offenders could be responsible for multiple crimes. Specialists compared crime scene characteristics. They reviewed forensic reports. They considered whether similarities existed between cases. Such comparisons are a standard part of major homicide investigations, particularly when offenders remain unidentified. In the Cook Van Quillenborg investigation, however, no publicly documented evidence ultimately established that the murders were linked to another known serial offender. The case remained its own mystery. As technology improved, forensic laboratories periodically re-examined preserved evidence using newer analytical methods. Advances allowed scientists to obtain increasingly detailed genetic information from biological samples that had been collected decades earlier. Evidence once considered too limited for meaningful analysis became significantly more valuable. Each advancement strengthened investigators' confidence that the preserved DNA might eventually identify the offender. But science still required one missing element: a name. Without a matching reference sample, the DNA profile remained anonymous. Investigators knew the killer genetically. They simply did not know him personally. For the families of Jay and Tanya, each passing year carried a mixture of hope and disappointment. Anniversaries returned every November. Birthdays passed. Holidays arrived with empty places at family gatherings. Time moved forward, but the unanswered questions remained unchanged. Families of homicide victims often describe a unique burden associated with unsolved cases. Grief becomes intertwined with uncertainty. There is no courtroom testimony explaining what happened. There is no conviction confirming responsibility. There is no final account of the crime. Instead, there are unanswered questions that survive year after year. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg's families continued cooperating with investigators whenever new developments occurred. They supported efforts to keep public attention focused on the case and remained hopeful that advances in science would eventually succeed where traditional investigation had not. Their patience reflected a reality familiar to cold case investigators. Justice sometimes moves slowly, very slowly. And meanwhile, forensic science continued evolving at a remarkable pace. By the early 21st century, DNA technology had become central to criminal investigations throughout North America. Laboratories could generate more complete genetic profiles from increasingly smaller samples. National databases expanded. Previously unsolved murders were being cleared with growing frequency. Yet despite these developments, the Cook Van Quillenborg case still resisted resolution. The offender's DNA remained unmatched. Detectives found themselves facing a difficult truth. The evidence was no longer the problem. The limitation lay elsewhere. The person responsible had either never entered the criminal justice system in a way that required DNA collection or had simply avoided circumstances that would place his profile into the database. Traditional comparison methods had reached their limit. Investigators needed something entirely different. Around this same period, a new concept was quietly beginning to emerge within forensic science. Researchers, genealogists, and law enforcement professionals were exploring whether genetic relationships, not direct database matches, could help identify unknown individuals. Rather than searching only for the offender's own DNA profile, investigators wondered whether relatives who had voluntarily submitted DNA for genealogical research might provide indirect clues. At first, the concept seemed almost revolutionary. Instead of asking, "Whose DNA is this?" the question became, "Who might this person be related to?" The idea would eventually become known as forensic genetic genealogy. In its earliest stages, it remained experimental and largely untested in criminal investigations. Detectives following the Cook Van Quillenborg case could not yet know that this developing field would someday transform their investigation. For now, they continued preserving the evidence, maintaining the files, reviewing the reports, waiting for science to catch up with the mystery. The killer, wherever he was, had lived for years believing he had escaped accountability. He had left behind biological evidence, but no name, no identification, no trail investigators could follow. What he could not know was that the science of identification was about to change forever. The evidence collected in 1987 had already survived decades. Soon it would begin telling investigators not exactly who the killer was, but who his family was. And that single shift in perspective would become the first real crack in a secret that had remained hidden for more than 30 years. The investigation had reached a point familiar to many cold case detectives. The evidence was strong enough to prove that a single unknown man had left behind his DNA. The forensic profile was reliable. It had been preserved, tested, and compared repeatedly. Yet the most advanced investigative tools available through traditional law enforcement databases had failed to produce a name. Years became decades. Detectives changed. Laboratory technology improved. The evidence remained the same. Then criminal investigations across the United States entered a new era. The change did not begin inside a police department. It began with genealogy. Millions of people had voluntarily submitted DNA samples to learn about their ancestry, discover distant relatives, or build family trees. Those databases had been created for personal research, not criminal investigations. But genetic science revealed something remarkable. Even if a person's own DNA was absent from a database, the DNA of relatives, sometimes distant relatives, could provide investigators with a starting point. Instead of searching for an exact match, investigators could search for family connections. The concept became known as forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional forensic DNA comparison, which seeks a direct match between crime scene evidence and an existing offender profile, forensic genetic genealogy combines DNA analysis with historical records, public documents, family trees, and genealogical research to identify possible relatives of an unknown individual. From there, investigators can gradually narrow their focus until one individual remains consistent with both the genetic evidence and the known facts of the case. The method represented a dramatic shift in investigative thinking. Rather than asking who left the DNA, investigators asked who could be related to the person who left it. By the mid-2010s, forensic genetic genealogy was beginning to demonstrate its potential in a small number of criminal investigations. Detectives working long unsolved homicide cases watched these developments closely. Cases that had resisted every conventional investigative method suddenly appeared capable of moving forward. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg became one of the investigations selected for this emerging approach. The biological evidence preserved since 1987 was suitable for advanced analysis. Scientists generated a DNA profile appropriate for genealogical comparison. Investigators then worked with specialists experienced in forensic genealogy to examine possible familial connections. The process was meticulous. It was not instantaneous. Contrary to popular imagination, no computer simply produced the killer's name. Researchers analyzed genetic relationships, identified individuals who appeared to share portions of DNA with the unknown contributor, and then began constructing extensive family trees using publicly available historical records, census information, birth records, marriage records, death certificates, newspaper archives, and other documented sources. Every branch had to be verified. Every relationship had to be confirmed. Every generation had to be traced carefully. And the investigation gradually narrowed. Potential family lines were identified. Researchers eliminated branches that could not fit the known facts of the case. Investigators compared ages, locations, family histories, and opportunities. The process required patience measured not in hours but in months. Eventually, the genealogical research pointed investigators toward one particular family. From there, detectives began identifying individuals who fit the biological, geographical, and chronological circumstances surrounding the murders. One name began attracting increasing attention: William Earl Talbot II. Talbot had lived in Washington state at the time of the murders. His age was consistent with the offender profile investigators had considered. The genealogical analysis suggested he could be the source of the unknown DNA recovered during the investigation. But genealogy alone was not evidence sufficient for arrest. Investigators still needed what criminal courts require: a direct DNA comparison. Only then could they determine whether the genealogical research had correctly identified the unknown man. Detectives therefore began conducting discreet surveillance. Like many investigations involving DNA confirmation, law enforcement sought an opportunity to obtain a biological sample that Talbot had discarded voluntarily in a public place. Such evidence can, under applicable legal standards and circumstances, be collected and compared because it has been abandoned. Investigators watched carefully. They waited. Eventually, they recovered a discarded item associated with Talbot that could provide DNA suitable for laboratory analysis. The sample was submitted for testing. Scientists compared the newly obtained DNA with the biological evidence preserved from Tanya Van Quedlinburg's murder. The results were decisive. The DNA matched. More than 30 years after Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg disappeared during what should have been an ordinary trip into Washington state, investigators finally had the answer they had pursued since November 1987. The unknown man was no longer unknown. On May 17, 2018, authorities arrested William Earl Talbot in Washington state and charged him with the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg. The announcement marked one of the earliest major homicide cases solved through forensic genetic genealogy. For investigators who had spent decades working the case, the moment represented the culmination of years of persistence. For the families, it represented something even more significant. After more than 3 decades of uncertainty, there was finally an identified suspect. Law enforcement officials emphasized that the breakthrough had been possible because the original investigators had preserved the forensic evidence with great care in 1987. Without those decisions made at the original crime scenes, later scientific advances could never have been applied. The evidence had survived. Science had advanced. The investigation had endured. Yet even after the arrest, important legal steps still remained. An arrest is not a conviction. Investigators now face the responsibility of presenting decades-old evidence in court. Prosecutors would need to explain not only the murders themselves, but also the scientific methods that had finally identified the suspect after so many years. The case would become more than a homicide trial. It would become one of the first major tests of forensic genetic genealogy before a jury. The outcome would matter not only for the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg, but also for investigators around the world watching to see whether this revolutionary investigative technique could withstand the scrutiny of a criminal courtroom. The secret that had survived since 1987 had finally been uncovered. Now the justice system would decide what that discovery meant. The arrest of William Earl Talbot on May 17, 2018, marked the first time in more than 30 years that investigators could attach a name to the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg. For the families, the announcement ended decades of uncertainty about who investigators believed was responsible. For detectives who had inherited the case across generations, it represented the culmination of thousands of hours of work that stretched back to November 1987. But inside the courtroom, the investigation entered an entirely different phase. The question was no longer whether detectives had identified a suspect. The question became whether prosecutors could prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that William Earl Talbot had committed the murders. Cases built on forensic genetic genealogy follow a careful legal distinction. Genetic genealogy itself is not presented to a jury as proof of guilt. Instead, it functions as an investigative tool, helping detectives identify possible suspects. Once investigators identify an individual, they must obtain evidence that is independently admissible in court. In the Cook and Van Quedlinburg case, that meant confirming the suspect's identity through a direct forensic DNA comparison using lawfully obtained biological material. That direct comparison became one of the central pillars of the prosecution's case. According to prosecutors, the DNA profile obtained from William Earl Talbot, the DNA matched the male DNA recovered during the original investigation. Unlike genealogical research, which points investigators toward possible relatives, this comparison involved standard forensic DNA analysis that has long been accepted in criminal courts. The prosecution also reconstructed the events surrounding the investigation for the jury. Jurors learned about Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg's planned trip from British Columbia into Washington state in November 1987. They heard evidence describing the discovery of Tanya's body near Alger and Jay's body near Monroe. They were presented with information concerning the abandoned van found in Bellingham and the extensive investigation that followed. The passage of time created obvious challenges. More than 3 decades had elapsed between the murders and the trial. Some witnesses had died. Others had limited memories of events that occurred in 1987. Investigators who originally worked the case had retired, requiring later detectives to explain both the historical investigation and the modern forensic developments that eventually identified the suspect. Preserved documentation became critically important. Crime scene photographs, laboratory reports, evidence logs, autopsy findings, contemporaneous investigative notes. Because these materials had been carefully maintained over the years, prosecutors were able to demonstrate continuity in the handling of evidence from the original investigation through the later forensic examinations. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's case, as is customary in criminal proceedings. Among other issues, defense attorneys questioned the reliability of certain evidence and argued that the state had not proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury's responsibility was not to evaluate public opinion or the history of the investigation. Its responsibility was to evaluate the evidence presented in court. After hearing testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury reached its verdict. In June 2019, William Earl Talbot de Sette-Empf was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder for the killings of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg. The verdict represented the first criminal conviction in the United States resulting from an investigation that prominently employed forensic genetic genealogy to identify a suspect before confirming that identity through conventional forensic DNA analysis. For many investigators across the country, the significance extended well beyond a single case. The conviction demonstrated that forensic genetic genealogy could successfully generate investigative leads that ultimately resulted in courtroom-tested evidence. Law enforcement agencies nationwide began examining unsolved homicide investigations for similar opportunities. Evidence that had remained preserved for decades suddenly acquired renewed importance. Cold case units expanded their collaboration with forensic laboratories and genealogical specialists. Families connected to unsolved murders watched these developments with cautious optimism. The Cook and Van Quedlinburg investigation had shown that time alone does not necessarily defeat justice. However, the legal story was not yet complete. Following the conviction, William Earl Talbot then pursued appellate review through the Washington court system. Appeals are a routine component of the criminal justice process, particularly in serious felony cases. They allow higher courts to review whether legal errors occurred during trial that may have affected the outcome. In 2022, the Washington Supreme Court reviewed issues connected to the trial and ultimately ordered a new trial based on the exclusion of certain evidence that the court concluded should have been admitted for the defense's consideration. The decision did not declare Talbot innocent, nor did it invalidate the DNA evidence. Instead, it reflected the appellate court's conclusion that the jury should have been allowed to consider additional evidence under the applicable legal standards. The ruling demonstrated another fundamental principle of the justice system. Even in cases involving compelling forensic evidence, courts remain responsible for ensuring that criminal trials comply with constitutional and procedural protections. A conviction must rest not only on persuasive evidence, but also on a fair legal process. Following the Supreme Court's decision, prosecutors prepared to retry the case. The investigation that had survived decades was now entering another chapter inside the courtroom. Throughout these proceedings, the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg continued to attend hearings and followed developments closely. For them, the legal process represented something deeply personal rather than simply historical. Their loved ones had left home in November 1987, expecting to return within days. Instead, they became victims in one of the Pacific Northwest's longest-running unsolved homicide investigations. The passage of more than 30 years had not diminished that loss. If anything, the years underscored the remarkable persistence required by everyone involved. The original investigators who collected evidence in 1987, the forensic scientists who preserved and analyzed biological material, the detectives who reopened the files again and again, the genealogists who painstakingly reconstructed family histories, the prosecutors who assembled a case spanning multiple generations. Each contribution depended upon the work completed by those who came before. No single breakthrough solved the murders. The resolution emerged through decades of cumulative effort. The case also became a reminder that forensic science continues evolving. The biological evidence collected from Tanya Van Quedlinburg's murder scene remained unchanged from the day investigators recovered it. And what changed was humanity's ability to interpret it. The evidence had been waiting. As science finally learned how to listen. And with that discovery, one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring cold cases ceased to be defined solely by mystery. It became a landmark in the history of modern criminal investigation, illustrating how meticulous evidence preservation, advances in DNA technology, and decades of perseverance can converge to identify a suspect long after the trail appears to have gone cold. The conviction in 2019 was widely viewed as a milestone in the history of forensic investigation, but the legal process surrounding the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg was not yet over. In criminal justice, particularly in cases carrying the most serious penalties, a jury's verdict does not always mark the end of the legal journey. Appeals exist to ensure that trials are conducted according to the law and that defendants receive the procedural protections guaranteed by the Constitution. Those principles apply regardless of the nature of the crime or the strength of the evidence. William Earl Talbot, Ed.N., exercised his right to appeal. The appellate process did not reopen the investigation into who had been identified through DNA. Instead, it examined whether the trial itself had been conducted fairly and whether legal decisions made by the trial court complied with Washington law. These questions are often misunderstood outside the courtroom. An appeal is not a second investigation. It is not an opportunity to retry the facts before a different jury. Rather, appellate judges review legal rulings, evidentiary decisions, and courtroom procedures to determine whether significant errors occurred that may have affected the outcome. In Talbot's case, one issue became particularly important. The defense argued that the jury should have been allowed to hear certain evidence relating to another individual whom the defense believed could have been considered as an alternative suspect. The trial court had excluded that evidence before the first trial. The question before the Washington Supreme Court was not whether that individual had committed the murders. Instead, the court examined whether the excluded evidence should have been admitted under Washington's legal standards governing third-party suspect evidence. In 2022, the Washington Supreme Court issued its decision. The court concluded that the trial court had improperly excluded certain evidence that the defense sought to present regarding an alternative suspect. As a result, the Supreme Court reversed Talbot's convictions and ordered a new trial. The ruling attracted national attention. Some headlines created confusion, suggesting that the DNA evidence had somehow been discredited. That was not what the court decided. The opinion did not reject the forensic DNA evidence linking Talbot to the investigation, nor did it conclude that another person had committed the murders. Instead, the court focused on a procedural issue: whether the jury should have been allowed to consider additional evidence offered by the defense when evaluating reasonable doubt. The distinction was significant. The decision reflected the justice system's commitment to fairness, even in cases involving compelling forensic evidence. For prosecutors, the Supreme Court's ruling meant preparing once again for trial. Much of the physical evidence remained exactly as it had been during the first proceedings. The DNA evidence still existed. The crime scene documentation remained preserved. The investigative records assembled over decades continued to form the foundation of the prosecution's case. The challenge was once again presenting a murder investigation that had begun in 1987 to a modern jury. Meanwhile, the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg faced another difficult chapter. More than 3 decades had already passed since the murders. They had endured years without answers. They had witnessed the breakthrough made possible by forensic genetic genealogy. They had attended a trial and heard guilty verdicts returned. Now they faced renewed legal proceedings because of questions concerning courtroom procedure rather than the underlying investigation itself. For many families of homicide victims, appeals can reopen emotional wounds long after they believe the legal process had reached its conclusion. Every hearing brings renewed media attention. Every court filing revisits painful events. Every legal argument returns the family to the circumstances of the crime. Yet throughout the proceedings, the historical facts surrounding the investigation remained unchanged. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg had traveled from British Columbia into Washington in November 1987. They disappeared during that trip. Tanya's body was discovered near Alger. Jay's body was discovered near Monroe. Their van was recovered in Bellingham. Investigators preserved biological evidence. Decades later, advances in forensic science led investigators to William Earl Talbot sit-in through forensic genetic genealogy, followed by a direct forensic DNA comparison. Those milestones remained part of the documented history of the investigation. The appellate proceedings instead demonstrated another important reality about criminal justice. Scientific evidence alone does not determine the outcome of a criminal case. Cortez must also ensure that trials are conducted according to established legal rules. Evidence must be presented properly. Witnesses must be examined fairly. Both prosecution and defense must have opportunities to present admissible evidence. Only then can a verdict withstand appellate review. The Cook-Van Quedlinburg investigation therefore became significant in 2 different ways. First, it demonstrated the extraordinary potential of forensic genetic genealogy to identify suspects in long unsolved murders. Second, it illustrated that even groundbreaking forensic investigations remain subject to the same constitutional protections that govern every criminal prosecution. Investigators across North America continued studying the case. Cold case units recognized that preserved biological evidence could hold answers for decades. Forensic laboratories refined genealogical techniques. Law enforcement agencies developed policies governing the use of investigative genetic genealogy, recognizing both its investigative value and the privacy questions it raised. The Cook and Van Quedlinburg murders became one of the earliest and most closely watched examples of those developments. What had begun as a tragic double homicide in 1987 had evolved into a landmark investigation influencing homicide inquiries throughout the United States and beyond. But beneath the legal arguments, the scientific advances, and the national attention remained to young lives that had been cut short. Jay was 20 years old. Tanya was 18. They had crossed the border expecting nothing more extraordinary than a shopping trip and the collection of furnace parts for a family business. Instead, their journey ended in one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring criminal investigations. For decades, investigators refused to abandon the evidence. For decades, the families refused to abandon hope. And for decades, the unknown DNA profile waited silently inside an evidence file, carrying in a name that science had not yet learned how to uncover. By the time that name was finally identified, an entire generation had grown up. Detectives had retired. Laboratory technology had transformed. Entire fields of forensic science had been created. Yet the evidence collected in November 1987 remained exactly where it had always been, carefully preserved, patiently waiting for the future. The future, eventually, arrived. For investigators, the Cook and Van Quedlinburg case became a landmark in forensic history. For scientists, it became one of the earliest demonstrations of what investigative genetic genealogy could accomplish. For prosecutors, it became a complex legal case stretching across decades. But for the people who had loved Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg, none of those descriptions captured the reality they had lived since November 1987. For them, the case was never about technology. It was about absence. Every cold case leaves behind more than evidence. It leaves birthdays that are no longer celebrated, Holidays marked by empty chairs. Family photographs that stopped growing because one chapter ended far too soon. Jay Cook was only 20 years old. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18. They had left Vancouver Island believing they would return home within days. Their plans were ordinary. Their destination was familiar. There was nothing extraordinary about a cross-border shopping trip in the Pacific Northwest during the late 1980s. Thousands of Canadians crossed into Washington every week. Their journey became extraordinary only because they never came home. During the early years of the investigation, their families worked closely with investigators in both Canada and the United States. Every new lead offered hope. Every telephone call carried the possibility of a breakthrough. Every report from detectives was followed with careful attention. As months became years, that hope changed. It did not disappear, but it became quieter, more patient. Families connected to unsolved homicides often describe living in two different worlds at the same time. One world continues moving forward. Careers change. Children grow older. Parents age. Entire decades pass. The other world remains permanently fixed on the day everything changed. For Jay and Tanya's families, November 1987 never completely disappeared. Every anniversary returned them to the beginning. Meanwhile, investigators continued preserving every piece of evidence collected during the original investigation. This decision would become one of the defining strengths of the case. Evidence preservation is often invisible to the public. Crime scene exhibits are carefully packaged, documented, stored, and protected under strict procedures. Biological samples must remain uncontaminated. Every transfer is recorded. Every examination is documented. These procedures may seem routine, but in cold cases, they become invaluable. The evidence recovered in 1987 survived because investigators understood that scientific methods would continue to evolve. They could not predict forensic genetic genealogy. They could not predict the DNA technology that would exist 30 years later. What they could do was ensure the evidence remained available. That foresight ultimately made the breakthrough possible. As DNA science advanced during the 1990s and 2000s, the Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation remained active within cold case units. Detectives periodically reviewed the files whenever improvements in forensic methods created new opportunities. Each review followed the same principle. Do not assume that yesterday's limitation will still exist tomorrow. That philosophy became increasingly important as other cold cases across North America began reaching successful conclusions through DNA evidence. Investigators watched these developments carefully. Every solved case demonstrated that preserved biological evidence still had the potential to answer old questions. By the time forensic genetic genealogy emerged as a practical investigative tool, detectives recognized that the Cook-Van Cuylenborg murders possessed exactly the type of preserved biological evidence needed for advanced analysis. The decision to pursue genealogical research was not made lightly. It required cooperation between forensic scientists, genealogists, prosecutors, and investigators. The process demanded extensive review before moving forward. When genealogical analysis eventually pointed investigators toward William Earl Talbot Eames, detectives still understood that genealogy alone could not close the case. Independent forensic confirmation remained essential. The direct DNA comparison ultimately provided that confirmation. When Talbot was arrested in May 2018, the announcement attracted international attention. The murders had occurred near the Canadian border. The victims were Canadian citizens. The investigation had involved cooperation between agencies in two countries. News organizations in both Canada and the United States reported that one of the Pacific Northwest's longest-running cold cases had finally produced an arrest. For many members of the public, another aspect of the story stood out. The murders had been solved not because someone suddenly confessed, not because a forgotten witness appeared, not because investigators stumbled across new physical evidence. The breakthrough came because evidence preserved for decades could finally be understood using scientific methods that did not exist when the murders occurred. That realization transformed public understanding of cold cases. Old investigations were no longer viewed simply as unsolved. They became investigations waiting for future science. Law enforcement agencies across North America began examining evidence rooms with renewed interest. Boxes that had remained unopened for years suddenly became valuable again. Preserved clothing, biological samples, trace evidence. Items once considered exhausted by earlier technology could now provide entirely new information. The Cook Van Quedlinburg investigation became one of the cases frequently discussed within law enforcement as an example of why evidence preservation matters. Every properly stored exhibit represented a future possibility. Every carefully documented chain of custody protected the integrity of later forensic testing. Every detective who chose not to discard evidence contributed, unknowingly, to the eventual breakthrough. The case also demonstrated the value of long-term cooperation. The murders crossed international boundaries. Canadian authorities and Washington investigators shared information throughout the investigation. Laboratories conducted analyses across different periods using evolving scientific techniques. Cold case detectives inherited work begun by investigators decades earlier. No single individual solved the murders. The investigation succeeded because generations of professionals continued building upon the work of those who came before them. That continuity became one of the case's greatest strengths. For the families, however, the investigation was never measured by forensic milestones or legal precedents. It was measured by time. 30 years. Then 31. 32. Every passing year represented another reminder of lives interrupted. When the arrest finally occurred, many family members publicly expressed gratitude to the investigators who had refused to abandon the case. Their appreciation reflected not only relief, but recognition that solving a cold case requires extraordinary persistence. Detectives who begin an investigation are often not the ones who finish it. Scientists who preserve evidence may never witness the breakthrough their work eventually enables. Justice in cold cases is often a relay rather than a sprint. One generation carries the investigation forward until another generation possesses better tools. That was precisely what happened here. The evidence remained patient. The investigators remained determined. The families remained hopeful. And eventually, science connected all three. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg became more than a solved cold case. They became proof that careful investigation does not end when immediate answers disappear. Sometimes the most important decision an investigator makes is simply refusing to close the file. Because somewhere inside the evidence, the truth may still be waiting for the future to arrive. By the time investigators arrested William Earl Talbot CNN in May 2018, more than 30 years had passed since Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg disappeared during their trip from British Columbia into Washington state. For most of those years, the investigation had existed in the frustrating space familiar to every cold case detective. The evidence was real. The victims had been identified. The crime scenes had been carefully processed. The biological evidence had been preserved. Yet the person responsible remained unknown. The case had not failed because investigators lacked determination. It had stalled because science had not yet reached the point where the available evidence could reveal a name. That distinction became one of the most important lessons in modern criminal investigation. Cold cases are often described as investigations that have gone cold. In reality, many have not. Many remain active through periodic reviews, new forensic examinations, renewed witness interviews, and technological advances. The Cook and Van Quedlinburg investigation demonstrated exactly how a case can remain alive for decades without producing immediate public developments. Following the arrest, investigators and prosecutors explained that the breakthrough depended upon to separate scientific processes. The first was forensic DNA analysis. The second was forensic genetic genealogy. Although they are closely connected, they are not the same. Traditional forensic DNA analysis compares a crime scene profile against known reference samples. If an individual's DNA already exists in a qualifying law enforcement database, investigators may obtain a direct match. That never happened in this investigation. Instead, detectives turned to forensic genetic genealogy, which searches for biological relatives rather than the offender himself. Genealogists then combine those genetic relationships with historical records to identify individuals who fit the available evidence. Once William Earl Talbot CNN emerged as a potential suspect through that investigative process, detectives obtained a discarded DNA sample associated with him and submitted it for conventional forensic comparison. Only after that direct comparison matched the biological evidence from the original investigation did prosecutors move forward with criminal charges. That sequence became critically important. The genealogy identified a lead. The forensic DNA confirmed it. The distinction helped investigators explain how the investigation had complied with established evidentiary standards while also demonstrating the value of an emerging investigative technique. As news of the arrest spread, law enforcement agencies across North America paid close attention. Cold case investigators recognized that thousands of unsolved murders contained preserved biological evidence collected years or even decades earlier. Many of those investigations had already exhausted traditional investigative methods. Now a new possibility existed. The Cook and Van Queilenborg investigation showed that unidentified DNA no longer represented the end of the road. It could become the beginning of a completely different investigative strategy. The case also highlighted another reality often overlooked by the public. Scientific breakthroughs are only possible when evidence has been properly preserved. Crime scene technicians in 1987 had no way of predicting the development of forensic genetic genealogy. They could not foresee the expansion of genealogical databases. They could not anticipate the computational tools that would eventually assist genealogists in reconstructing extensive family trees. What they could do was collect evidence carefully, document it accurately, and preserve it according to accepted forensic standards. Because they did, investigators decades later still possessed biological material suitable for advanced testing. Evidence preservation became one of the defining themes of the case. Every sealed evidence package represented trust in the future. Every documented chain of custody protected the reliability of later scientific analysis. Every forensic decision made in 1987 continued influencing the investigation more than 30 years later. The Cook and Van Queilenborg murders also encouraged renewed investment in cold case units throughout many jurisdictions. Police agencies increasingly recognized that unsolved homicides should not simply remain archived indefinitely. Instead, investigators began systematically reviewing older cases to determine whether preserved evidence could benefit from modern forensic methods. Some agencies created specialized cold case teams. Others expanded partnerships with forensic laboratories and genealogical experts. Training programs evolved to include emerging investigative technologies. Although each investigation remained unique, the underlying principle remained consistent. Old evidence deserves new science. The case likewise contributed to broader discussions concerning investigative genetic genealogy and privacy. Because genealogical databases had originally been developed for ancestry research rather than criminal investigations, their use in law enforcement generated significant public debate. Policymakers, legal scholars, privacy advocates, and forensic experts examined questions regarding consent, access, and appropriate investigative safeguards. Those discussions extended well beyond the Cook and Van Queilenborg investigation. Nevertheless, the case became one of the prominent examples referenced during conversations about how the technology should be used responsibly. Many law enforcement agencies subsequently developed formal policies governing investigative genetic genealogy. These policies generally emphasize that genealogy functions as an investigative, led rather than courtroom evidence, requiring independent forensic confirmation before criminal charges are pursued. That principle reflected precisely what had occurred in this investigation. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg, however, the scientific and policy discussions remained secondary. Their lives had been shaped by loss long before forensic genealogy entered the investigation. The breakthrough provided answers that had seemed impossible for decades. It identified the suspect. It explained why investigators had finally made an arrest. It demonstrated that the investigation had never been forgotten. Throughout the years, detectives had continued protecting the evidence because they believed future science might accomplish what earlier science could not. That belief had been justified. The investigation also underscored the extraordinary patience required by cold case work. Unlike television dramas, real homicide investigations rarely produce immediate breakthroughs. Evidence must be tested carefully. Laboratory procedures require validation. Investigative decisions require documentation. Genealogical research demands painstaking verification across multiple generations of family history. Months of work may eliminate only a single possibility. Progress often occurs quietly, without headlines or public announcements. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case illustrated that reality. Its breakthrough appeared sudden only because decades of preparation had remained largely invisible. Behind the arrest stood thousands of investigative decisions stretching back to November 1987. Each decision mattered. Each report mattered. Each preserved sample mattered. By 2018, the investigation had become something greater than a single homicide case. It had become evidence that determination and scientific progress can eventually intersect. The unknown DNA profile that had remained anonymous for decades now carried a name. The mystery that had frustrated investigators across generations had finally begun yielding answers. But the case's influence was only beginning. Across North America, detectives opened evidence boxes that had not been examined in years. They looked at preserved biological samples differently. Instead of seeing investigations that had reached dead ends, they saw possibilities. And in police evidence rooms across the continent, countless forgotten files suddenly carried renewed hope because one investigation in Washington state had proven that sometimes the smallest fragment of DNA can speak long after every witness has fallen silent. For decades, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remained defined by one overwhelming question. Detectives knew a violent crime had occurred. They knew where the victims had been found. They knew that biological evidence connected an unknown male to Tanya Van Cuylenborg's murder. Yet they did not know who that man was. The answer existed inside the evidence from the very beginning, but for more than 30 years, science lacked the ability to translate that answer into an identity. That reality is what separates many modern cold cases from those of previous generations. The evidence is often not missing. The technology simply has not caught up with it. When the murders occurred in November 1987, DNA profiling was still an emerging forensic discipline. The first criminal cases using DNA evidence had only recently demonstrated its potential. Laboratories possessed far fewer analytical tools than they do today. Processing biological samples required significantly larger quantities of genetic material, and the databases that now support criminal investigations did not yet exist. Even so, investigators recognized the importance of preserving every possible piece of forensic evidence. Crime scene personnel carefully collected biological material, documented where it had been found, and maintained strict chain of custody records. Those procedures may have appeared routine at the time, but they ultimately became the foundation upon which the entire investigation would later depend. As forensic science evolved during the 1990s, laboratories developed increasingly sensitive methods for analyzing DNA. Short tandem repeat, or STIRGER, profiling became the accepted standard for forensic identification in the United States. Scientists could generate reliable genetic profiles from much smaller biological samples than had previously been possible. These advances allowed investigators to establish an unknown DNA profile connected to the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation. The profile itself represented an extraordinary achievement. It identified one unknown individual with remarkable scientific precision. But it still lacked a name. Investigators compared that profile against criminal DNA databases, hoping the offender had previously provided a qualifying sample through another criminal case. The comparison produced no match. For many years, that absence defined the investigation. The DNA existed. The identity did not. Then another scientific revolution quietly began changing forensic investigations. Forensic genetic genealogy approached the problem from an entirely different direction. Rather than asking whether the unknown DNA matched someone already known to law enforcement, genealogists asked whether the unknown person shared ancestry with individuals who had voluntarily submitted DNA for genealogical research. The distinction changed everything. Human DNA carries information not only about individuals, but also about biological relationships. Parents and children share approximately half their DNA. Siblings, cousins, grandparents, and more distant relatives each share predictable portions of their genetic material. If investigators could identify relatives of the unknown individual, They might reconstruct family trees until only one person fit both the genetics and the known facts of the investigation. The process required extraordinary patience. Genealogists examined shared DNA segments. They reviewed historical records, birth certificates, marriage records, death certificates, obituaries, census documents, public archives. Each generation had to be verified before researchers moved to the next. The work resembled historical research as much as forensic science. Eventually, those separate disciplines converged. A family tree narrowed. Investigators focused on William Earl Talbot II. Only then did detectives return to traditional forensic practice. A discarded biological sample associated with Talbot was obtained through lawful investigative methods. The laboratory compared that sample directly with the preserved DNA recovered during the original investigation. The comparison produced a match. That scientific confirmation transformed an investigative lead into courtroom evidence. One of the remarkable aspects of the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation was that the evidence itself had remained fundamentally unchanged since 1987. The DNA had not become stronger. The biological material had not become different. Science had changed. Laboratory techniques had improved. Analytical methods had expanded. Investigators had learned new ways to ask questions of evidence that had been waiting silently for decades. This distinction became enormously influential within the forensic community. Many investigators realized that unsolved murders from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s might contain preserved biological evidence capable of benefiting from the same advances. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case therefore represented more than one successful investigation. It represented proof that future scientific developments could continue transforming historical evidence. The case also emphasized an essential principle of forensic investigation. Evidence cannot predict the future. Investigators cannot know which scientific methods will exist decades later. Their responsibility is to preserve evidence carefully enough that future scientists can examine it using techniques not yet invented. Every sealed evidence package, therefore, becomes an investment in future knowledge. The original investigators in 1987 could not have anticipated forensic genetic genealogy. Yet because they preserved the evidence properly, later generations possess the opportunity to apply it. This continuity between generations of investigators became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The detectives who processed the original crime scenes, the forensic scientists who preserved the biological evidence, the laboratory analysts who later developed the DNA profile, the genealogists who reconstructed family relationships, the detectives who conducted surveillance, the prosecutors who presented the evidence in court. Each stage depended upon the integrity of every earlier stage. No single breakthrough existed in isolation. The investigation succeeded because decades of careful work accumulated without interruption. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg also became a reminder that scientific certainty does not eliminate the human tragedy underlying every homicide investigation. Behind every DNA profile stands a victim. Behind every laboratory report stands a family. Behind every forensic breakthrough stands a life interrupted. Jay Cook never returned to British Columbia. Tanya Van Cuylenborg never completed the ordinary weekend trip she had planned. Their families spent more than 30 years waiting for investigators to answer the most painful question imaginable. Who did this? Science eventually provided that answer, but it could never restore the future they had lost. For investigators, however, another lesson endured. Cold cases are rarely solved by luck alone. They are solved because evidence is preserved. Because investigators refuse to abandon difficult files. Because scientists continue improving analytical methods. And because each generation builds upon the work of those who came before. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation demonstrated all of those principles with extraordinary clarity. It showed that biological evidence possesses remarkable patience. Unlike human memory, DNA does not forget. Unlike witnesses, it does not grow uncertain over time. Unlike suspects, it does not change its story. It simply waits, waiting for the moment when science becomes capable of hearing what it has been saying all along. In this investigation, That moment arrived more than 3 decades after 2 young Canadians disappeared during what should have been an ordinary trip across the border. When it finally came, the evidence spoke with unmistakable clarity. The secret that had survived since 1987 was no longer hidden. The science had finally caught up. By the time the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were linked to William Earl Talbot set in through forensic genetic genealogy and confirmed by conventional DNA analysis, the investigation had already become part of criminal justice history. It was no longer remembered solely because of the brutality of the crimes or the extraordinary length of the investigation. It became one of the cases most frequently discussed whenever investigators, forensic scientists, and legal scholars examined the future of cold case investigations. The significance extended far beyond Washington state. For decades, law enforcement agencies around the world had faced the same painful reality. Evidence existed. Victims had names. Families continued waiting. But investigators had no identifiable suspect. Many cases reached what detectives commonly describe as an investigative ceiling. Every witness had been interviewed. Every available lead had been examined. Every traditional forensic comparison had been completed. The investigation could continue, but it could not move forward. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg murders demonstrated that an investigative ceiling is not necessarily permanent. Sometimes it reflects only the limits of current technology. Once forensic genetic genealogy proved capable of identifying investigative leads, cold case units across the United States began reviewing their evidence inventories with renewed urgency. Detectives recognized that biological samples collected years earlier might contain information that had simply been inaccessible at the time. Evidence rooms became places of renewed possibility. Boxes that had remained sealed for decades were reopened. Laboratories reassessed preserved biological material. Investigators examined whether unsolved cases possessed the type of DNA evidence necessary for genealogical analysis. The impact was immediate. Additional cold cases began moving forward. Although every investigation remained unique, the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case served as one of the earliest demonstrations that careful evidence preservation combined with modern genealogy could transform an investigation once believed unsolvable. The case also highlighted the importance of collaboration. No single discipline solved the murders. Traditional homicide detectives documented the original crime scenes. Crime scene technicians preserved biological evidence. Forensic scientists generated DNA profiles. Genealogists reconstructed family histories. Prosecutors evaluated legal standards. Laboratory specialists confirmed direct DNA comparisons. Each profession contributed a different piece of the investigation. The final result reflected decades of cooperation rather than a single dramatic discovery. That collaborative model became increasingly common as forensic genetic genealogy expanded. Cold case investigations began relying upon multidisciplinary teams rather than a single investigative approach. Scientists worked alongside historians. Genealogists worked alongside detectives. Digital researchers worked alongside forensic laboratories. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation illustrated how these different specialties could complement one another while remaining grounded in established evidentiary standards. The case also prompted discussions concerning the ethical use of investigative genetic genealogy. Because genealogy databases were originally developed for ancestry research, questions naturally arose regarding privacy, consent, and appropriate law enforcement access. These discussions involved legislators, legal scholars, forensic scientists, genealogists, and privacy advocates. The objective was not to eliminate the investigative tool. Rather, it was to establish clear standards governing its responsible use. Many agencies subsequently adopted formal policies specifying that forensic genetic genealogy should be used only in serious violent crimes or unidentified human remains investigations, and that any genealogical lead must be independently confirmed through traditional forensic evidence before criminal charges are filed. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation reflected those principles. Genealogy generated the investigative lead. Conventional forensic DNA confirmed the identity. Only after that confirmation did the criminal case proceed. This distinction became central to public understanding of the technology. Genealogy did not replace forensic science. It expanded the investigative path that ultimately led investigators back to established forensic methods. For the families, however, these broader discussions remained secondary. Their story had always been deeply personal. And Jay Cook had been 20 years old. Tanya Van Quillenborg had been 18. Their lives were measured not by legal precedents or scientific milestones, but by ordinary moments that ended unexpectedly. A weekend trip, a family errand, and plans to return home. Everything familiar disappeared within days. When investigators finally identified a suspect decades later, the announcement did not erase the years of uncertainty. It did not restore birthdays that had passed. It did not replace the opportunities that had been lost. What it provided was truth. That truth carries profound importance in homicide investigations. Families often explain that uncertainty creates its own form of suffering. Questions remain unanswered. Possibilities remain open. The imagination fills gaps left by incomplete information. Identifying the person investigators believe responsible cannot undo the crime. But it can replace uncertainty with evidence. It can replace speculation with documented facts. That transition represents one of the fundamental purposes of criminal investigation. Throughout the decades-long inquiry, one theme remained remarkably consistent: patience. The investigation required patience from detectives who inherited files begun before they entered law enforcement. It required patience from forensic laboratories waiting for scientific advances. It required patience from prosecutors assembling a case spanning generations. Most of all, it required patience from families who refused to abandon hope despite the passing years. Cold case investigators often emphasize that solving an old homicide rarely depends upon one dramatic breakthrough. Instead, success usually results from countless smaller decisions: preserving evidence, maintaining documentation, reviewing files, testing new technology, following emerging investigative methods. Each decision may appear insignificant in isolation. Together, they create the possibility of resolution. That is precisely what occurred in the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg. No witness suddenly remembered the killer, and no hidden confession emerged. No forgotten piece of evidence unexpectedly appeared. The critical evidence had existed from the beginning. Investigators simply needed 30 years of scientific progress before they could fully understand what that evidence revealed. The case, therefore, became something larger than its own investigation. It became a reminder to law enforcement agencies everywhere that evidence should never be underestimated merely because current technology cannot answer every question. Future science may ask different questions. Future investigators may possess different tools. Future generations may discover what earlier generations could not. The evidence collected in November 1987 quietly demonstrated that principle for more than 3 decades. It remained unchanged. It remained preserved. It remained truthful. And when the necessary science finally arrived, it transformed one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring mysteries into a landmark chapter in the history of modern forensic investigation. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg stretched across more than 3 decades, but the investigation was never truly the work of a single detective, a single laboratory, or a single generation. It became something much larger. It became an example of how justice can outlive the careers of the people who first began searching for it. When the investigation started in November 1987, the world looked very different. There were no smartphones, and no social media, no digital mapping systems capable of instantly reconstructing travel routes. DNA analysis was still in its infancy. Forensic genetic genealogy did not exist as an investigative discipline. The detectives who first responded to the murders worked with the best tools available to them at the time. They photographed the crime scenes, interviewed witnesses, searched for physical evidence, and documented every observation with extraordinary care. They could not know that investigators decades later would depend upon every report they wrote. That continuity became one of the defining strengths of the case. The evidence did not belong to one generation of investigators. It belonged to the investigation itself. Every detective who inherited the file accepted responsibility for continuing work that others had begun years earlier. Cold case investigations demand that kind of institutional memory. Unlike ordinary criminal cases, they often outlast careers. Detectives retire. Laboratory personnel change. Prosecutors move into different positions. Yet the evidence remains. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation demonstrated how essential careful record-keeping becomes under those circumstances. Every evidence transfer had been documented. Every laboratory examination had been recorded. Every investigative decision could be reconstructed years later. Without that continuity, modern investigators would have struggled to understand what had already been done and what opportunities still remained. The case therefore became an important example within law enforcement training. Evidence preservation is not simply about solving today's crimes. It is about protecting tomorrow's opportunities. A properly maintained chain of custody allows future investigators to rely confidently upon evidence collected decades earlier. That principle proved indispensable in this investigation. The biological evidence recovered in 1987 remained suitable for advanced DNA analysis because it had been carefully preserved throughout the intervening years. The documentation accompanying that evidence allowed forensic scientists to understand its origin, handling, and integrity. Those details became critically important once prosecutors presented the case in court. Jurors needed confidence not only in the scientific testing, but also in the reliability of the evidence itself. That confidence depended upon decades of meticulous documentation. The investigation also highlighted another reality that often receives less public attention. Cold case work requires extraordinary persistence. Many investigations continue despite years without significant developments. Files are reviewed repeatedly. New technologies are evaluated. Laboratories revisit preserved evidence. Potential leads are reconsidered. Most reviews do not produce immediate breakthroughs. Yet investigators continue because they understand that scientific progress rarely follows predictable timelines. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg murders reflected exactly that pattern. For years, detectives possessed DNA evidence without possessing the ability to identify its source. The traditional database comparisons produced no answers. The evidence seemed complete, yet incomplete at the same time. Everything changed only when forensic genetic genealogy created an entirely new investigative pathway. That development reinforced another lesson for homicide investigators. Scientific limitations should never be mistaken for evidentiary limitations. Evidence may remain capable of answering questions that current technology cannot yet ask. This philosophy has increasingly influenced cold case investigations around the world. Rather than concluding that evidence has been exhausted, investigators now ask whether future scientific developments may reveal additional information. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case became one of the strongest examples supporting that approach. The investigation also demonstrated the value of international cooperation. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were Canadian citizens. The murders occurred in Washington state. The investigation required ongoing communication between Canadian authorities and multiple American law enforcement agencies. Information crossed the international border repeatedly. Families remained in Canada while investigators worked in the United States. Despite these logistical challenges, cooperation continued throughout the investigation. That collaboration reflected the reality that violent crime does not always respect political boundaries. Successful investigations, therefore, depend upon agencies working together rather than independently. The case also reminded investigators that every homicide investigation begins with people rather than evidence. Jay Cook was remembered by those who knew him as a young man with plans for the future. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was remembered as a young woman whose life ended before adulthood had fully unfolded. Their names never disappeared from the investigation. Every laboratory report, every court hearing, every forensic examination, every investigative review, all existed for one purpose: to determine what happened to them. This focus remained important as public attention increasingly centered upon forensic genealogy. The technology itself became widely discussed. Yet investigators consistently emphasized that science was simply a tool. The purpose remained justice for victims. The murders of Jay and Tanya illustrated that distinction clearly. Without the victims, there would have been no investigation. Without careful evidence collection, there would have been no scientific breakthrough. Without decades of persistence, there would have been no identification. Each element depended upon the others. As the years passed following the 2018 arrest, the case continued influencing homicide investigations internationally. Training conferences referenced it. Forensic publications discussed it. Cold case investigators studied it. Not because every investigation could be solved identically, but because the principles remained universally applicable. Preserve evidence. Document everything. Remain open to scientific progress. Review old assumptions. And never assume that time has defeated the truth. Those principles reached far beyond Washington state. They became part of the evolving philosophy of modern homicide investigation. The Cook and Van Quedlinburg murders therefore occupy a unique place in criminal justice history. They represent both profound personal tragedy and remarkable investigative perseverance. They demonstrate how science can expand the possibilities available to law enforcement. They illustrate why evidence collected today may become far more valuable tomorrow. Most importantly, they remind investigators that justice sometimes depends upon patience measured not in days or months, but in generations. Because while memories fade, careers end, and decades pass, properly preserved evidence continues waiting for the moment when the future finally becomes capable of understanding the past. In the case of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg, that moment arrived after more than 30 years. The evidence had remained silent, but it had never stopped telling the truth. Long before the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg became known as a landmark in forensic history, they were a deeply personal tragedy. Before the DNA comparisons, before the genealogy charts, before the courtroom proceedings and scientific breakthroughs, there were simply two young people whose lives ended during what should have been an ordinary trip across the Canadian border. That truth never changed. As investigators discussed forensic evidence and prosecutors prepared legal arguments, the families continued carrying memories that had nothing to do with laboratory reports. They remembered birthdays, family gatherings, everyday conversations, plans that would never be completed. Cold cases often become known by their investigative milestones. This case became known for forensic genetic genealogy. But for the families, the milestones looked very different. The day Jay and Tanya left home. The day they failed to return. The day investigators confirmed that Tanya had been found. The day Jay's body was discovered. The years that followed. The decades that followed. Then, finally, the announcement in 2018 that investigators believed they had identified the man responsible. For families affected by homicide, the passage of time rarely follows the same rhythm as it does for everyone else. The calendar continues. Life moves forward, but the unanswered questions remain fixed. Every anniversary brings the investigation back into focus. Every public update revives memories that have never completely disappeared. The Cook and Van Quedlinburg investigation became remarkable because those anniversaries continued for more than 30 years before an arrest was made. Throughout that period, law enforcement agencies never formally abandoned the investigation. Like many successful cold case inquiries, it remained active through periodic reviews. Evidence was re-examined. Laboratory techniques improved. Investigators reconsidered previous assumptions. Every significant advancement in forensic DNA technology created another opportunity to revisit the preserved biological evidence. This pattern reflects how many cold case investigations actually function. They are not forgotten. They evolve. As science changes, investigators return to evidence that earlier generations could not fully interpret. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg became one of the clearest demonstrations of this process. The evidence collected in November 1987 never changed. The questions investigators asked of that evidence did. That distinction transformed the investigation. The biological material recovered during the original inquiry eventually supported advanced DNA analysis. Later, it became suitable for forensic genetic genealogy. Finally, it led investigators toward William Earl Talbot II, whose identity was confirmed through conventional forensic DNA comparison. Each scientific step built upon the one before it. None replaced the earlier work. Instead, decades of investigation accumulated into a single chain of evidence stretching from the original crime scenes to the modern courtroom. The case also highlighted the importance of maintaining public confidence in forensic science. Investigators consistently explained that genetic genealogy itself was not the evidence presented to establish guilt. Rather, it served as an investigative method for identifying a possible suspect. The direct forensic DNA comparison remained the scientific evidence supporting the prosecution. This distinction became increasingly important as investigative genetic genealogy gained national attention. Law enforcement agencies recognized the need to explain the technology accurately. Public understanding depended upon recognizing that genealogy generated leads, while traditional forensic procedures provided courtroom evidence. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation therefore became an educational example as well as a criminal case. Police academies, cold case conferences, forensic science programs, legal seminars, all examined the investigation from different perspectives. Detectives studied the investigative strategy. Scientists examined the forensic methods. Lawyers considered the evidentiary issues. Genealogists analyzed the family tree research that ultimately contributed to identifying the suspect. Yet every professional discussion returned to the same fundamental point. None of the later achievements would have been possible without the work completed in 1987. The original investigators had carefully secured the crime scenes. Evidence technicians had preserved biological samples. Laboratories had protected the integrity of those exhibits. Every later success depended upon those early decisions. The investigation became a reminder that excellence in forensic work often produces results years after the original crime. That lesson influenced cold case investigations across North America. Police agencies increasingly emphasized long-term evidence preservation. Laboratories expanded procedures for retaining biological evidence. Investigators became more cautious about assuming that existing technology represented the limits of future science. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg murders helped reinforce that philosophy. Evidence should not be evaluated solely by what it can prove today. It should also be preserved for what it may prove tomorrow. For the families, however, no scientific lesson could outweigh the personal reality of their loss. Justice, when it finally began moving forward, could identify the person investigators believed responsible. It could explain how detectives reached that conclusion. It could present evidence before a jury. But it could not return November 1987. It could not restore the years that followed. It could not recreate the futures Jay and Tanya never had the opportunity to live. That truth remains at the center of every homicide investigation. Criminal cases often become remembered through legal decisions, investigative breakthroughs, or forensic milestones. The victims deserve to be remembered for something else. For their lives. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were not simply names in an evidence file. They were two young Canadians who crossed the border expecting to return home. Instead, they became victims of one of the Pacific Northwest's longest-running murder investigations. Their case changed forensic history. It influenced cold case investigations throughout North America. It demonstrated the remarkable potential of investigative genetic genealogy. But beneath every scientific achievement remained the same human story that began more than 3 decades earlier. To families waiting. To lives interrupted. To names that investigators refused to forget. That refusal became the defining characteristic of the investigation. The detectives changed. The science changed. The legal landscape changed. The evidence remained. And because it remained, the search for truth never truly ended. It simply waited for the future to catch up with the past. Part 13. The Lasting Legacy of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Historically documented continuation, cinematic documentary voiceover. More than 3 decades separated the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg from the scientific breakthrough that finally identified a suspect. During those years, the investigation became something larger than a single criminal case. It evolved into a defining example of how persistence, evidence preservation, and scientific innovation can intersect across generations. It also became a reminder that justice is rarely measured by speed alone. Sometimes it is measured by endurance. When investigators first processed the crime scenes in November 1987, they could not know that their work would still be examined decades later. Every photograph they took, every piece of evidence they sealed, Every report they completed would eventually become part of a historical record studied not only by detectives, but also by forensic scientists, legal scholars, and law enforcement agencies seeking to improve future homicide investigations. The investigation therefore left two distinct legacies. The first belonged to criminal justice. The second belonged to the victims. From an investigative standpoint, the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case demonstrated the extraordinary importance of preserving physical evidence, even when immediate scientific methods appear limited. Modern forensic laboratories are often praised for technological breakthroughs, but those breakthroughs depend entirely upon evidence that has been collected and protected correctly. The DNA evidence that ultimately helped identify William Earl Talbot Theodon had not become stronger with age. It had not changed. Its value increased because science advanced. This principle continues shaping cold case investigations today. Law enforcement agencies now routinely review older homicide files whenever new forensic techniques become available. Cases that once seemed permanently unsolved are reconsidered in light of improved laboratory methods, expanded DNA analysis, and investigative technologies that did not exist when the original crimes occurred. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation became one of the strongest examples supporting that approach. It proved that evidence should never be judged solely by present capabilities. Future science may reveal answers that current science cannot. Another lasting lesson involved cooperation. The investigation required coordination between multiple agencies in Washington state, Canadian authorities, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, and genealogical specialists. Each contributed expertise that no single organization possessed alone. Modern homicide investigations increasingly reflect this collaborative model. Cold case detectives rely upon forensic scientists. Forensic scientists rely upon laboratory technicians. Genealogists rely upon historical records. Prosecutors rely upon investigators who have maintained meticulous documentation for years or even decades. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case illustrated how these different professions can work together toward a common objective. The legal proceedings also highlighted an equally important principle. Scientific evidence must always be accompanied by procedural fairness. The appellate process demonstrated that courts remain responsible for ensuring that criminal trials comply with established legal standards, regardless of the seriousness of the crime or the strength of the forensic evidence. That balance lies at the heart of the justice system. The search for truth depends not only upon identifying suspects, but also upon conducting legal proceedings fairly. The investigation therefore became significant for both forensic science and criminal law. Yet beneath every discussion of DNA, genealogy, appellate review, or investigative procedure remained the story of two young people whose lives ended long before those debates began. Jay Cook was 20 years old. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18. Their names became associated with a landmark investigation, but they should also be remembered apart from it. They were family members. They were loved. They had plans extending beyond a single weekend in November 1987. Their journey across the Canadian border was intended to be ordinary. Instead, it became one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring homicide investigations. The years that followed demonstrated remarkable determination on the part of investigators. Cold case work often receives little public attention. There are no daily headlines, no dramatic arrests, and no immediate courtroom victories. Instead, investigators spend years reviewing files, re-examining evidence, and waiting for opportunities created by scientific progress. That quiet persistence rarely attracts public recognition. Yet without it, many cold cases would never be solved. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation serves as an enduring reminder of the value of that persistence. Every detective who reopened the file contributed. Every forensic scientist who re-examined evidence contributed. Every genealogist who reconstructed family relationships contributed. Every prosecutor who prepared the case contributed. Justice became possible because each generation refused to assume that earlier limitations would remain permanent. This philosophy has influenced countless subsequent investigations. Across North America, evidence rooms continue holding biological samples collected years or decades earlier. Investigators now understand that today's unanswered questions may become tomorrow's solved cases. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg murders helped establish that expectation. Evidence should be preserved. Cold cases should be reviewed. Scientific progress should be embraced carefully and responsibly. If hope should never be abandoned simply because time has passed. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. The time changes witnesses. Time changes investigators. Time changes technology. But time does not necessarily destroy the truth. The biological evidence collected in November 1987 waited silently through changing decades, changing governments, changing forensic laboratories, and changing generations of detectives. It never altered its story. It simply waited until science possessed the ability to understand it. When that day finally arrived, the investigation moved forward with a clarity that had seemed impossible for more than 30 years. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remain a profound tragedy. Nothing about the passage of time lessens that reality. Nothing about scientific success restores what was taken from their families. But the investigation demonstrated that careful evidence, patient investigators, and advancing science can sometimes overcome even the longest silence. It is a lesson that continues guiding homicide investigators around the world. A lesson written not in theory, but in one of the most significant cold case investigations of the modern forensic era. Some criminal investigations end within hours. Others end within days. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg demanded more than 3 decades. Not because investigators stopped searching. Not because the evidence disappeared. But because the answer existed years before science possessed the ability to recognize it. That is what makes this case unlike almost any other. It began with 2 young Canadians crossing the border into Washington state during November 1987. Their plans were ordinary. They intended to collect furnace parts for Jay Cook's father's business, spend time together, and return home. There was no indication that anyone close to them expected danger. Nothing in the documented facts suggested they anticipated becoming victims of one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring unsolved homicide investigations. Within days, everything changed. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was found murdered near Alger in Skagit County. Jay Cook was found murdered near Monroe in Snohomish County. Their van was discovered abandoned in Bellingham. The physical evidence established that the crimes were connected. The offender had disappeared. The investigation expanded across jurisdictions. Detectives interviewed witnesses. Crime scene specialists collected forensic evidence. Laboratories preserved biological material with meticulous care. Thousands of investigative hours followed. Yet no suspect could be identified. For years, the case represented one of countless investigations waiting for scientific progress. The evidence had done everything investigators could reasonably ask of it. It had preserved a genetic profile. It had remained uncontaminated. It had survived decades inside secure evidence storage. The missing piece was not evidence. The missing piece was technology. As DNA science advanced, investigators continued reviewing the case. Traditional database comparisons produced no direct match. The unknown DNA profile remained anonymous. But investigators refused to discard the evidence or abandon the investigation. That decision ultimately changed everything. The emergence of forensic genetic genealogy created an entirely new investigative path. Instead of searching for the offender directly, investigators searched for biological relatives. Genealogists reconstructed family histories. Historical records were examined. Family trees were built. Generations were traced. Eventually, the investigation narrowed toward William Earl Talbot's estate. Detectives then obtained a discarded DNA sample associated with him. Conventional forensic DNA analysis confirmed that the sample matched the biological evidence recovered during the original investigation. Only after that direct scientific confirmation did prosecutors file criminal charges. The investigation had reached a point that had seemed impossible for more than 30 years. An unknown DNA profile now had a documented identity. The arrest in 2018 attracted international attention because it demonstrated the practical potential of forensic genetic genealogy. The subsequent legal proceedings showed another equally important truth. Scientific innovation must always operate within the framework of established legal protections. The criminal justice system requires reliable evidence. It also requires fair procedures. The appellate decisions that followed reflected those principles, emphasizing that even the most compelling investigations remain subject to constitutional safeguards. This balance remains one of the defining characteristics of modern justice. Forensic science identifies possibilities. Courts evaluate admissible evidence. Juries determine facts. Appellate courts ensure that legal standards have been respected. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation became significant because it demonstrated all of these elements working together across multiple generations. Yet beyond every legal discussion, every forensic advancement, and every investigative milestone remained the same human story. Jay Cook was 20 years old. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18. They were not remembered because they became part of forensic history. They became part of forensic history because their lives were taken. Their families waited through changing decades for answers. Investigators waited for science. Science eventually provided a path toward identification. Nothing about that process erased the tragedy, and nothing restored the years that had passed. Nothing returned the futures that had been lost. Justice in homicide investigations is never measured by perfect endings. There are none. Instead, justice is measured by the determination to continue searching for truth even after hope appears distant. That determination defined this investigation from beginning to end. The detectives who processed the original crime scenes in 1987 never stopped preserving the evidence. The investigators who inherited the files never stopped reviewing the case. The forensic scientists never stopped improving analytical methods. The genealogists never stopped tracing family relationships until the evidence pointed toward a single individual. Each generation carried the investigation forward. Each relied upon the work completed by those who came before. The case therefore stands as one of the clearest demonstrations that solving a cold case rarely depends upon one extraordinary moment. Instead, it depends upon thousands of ordinary decisions made correctly. Collect the evidence carefully. Document it accurately. Preserve it responsibly. Review it patiently. Remain willing to reconsider old assumptions. Trust that future science may answer questions current science cannot. These principles now guide cold case investigations throughout the world. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg helped reshape how investigators think about unsolved crimes. Evidence once considered exhausted is now viewed as a potential source of future answers. Cold case units routinely revisit decades-old investigations. Forensic laboratories continue refining methods capable of extracting new information from preserved biological material. Investigative genetic genealogy has become an important tool in appropriate cases, while agencies continue developing policies that balance its investigative value with legal and ethical considerations. The influence of this investigation therefore extends far beyond Washington state. Its lessons are taught in police academies. Its forensic methods are studied in laboratories. Its legal issues are examined in courtrooms and law schools. Its investigative persistence continues inspiring detectives working unsolved homicides around the world. But perhaps the greatest lesson is also the simplest. Truth has remarkable patience. It does not rush. It does not disappear simply because years pass. Sometimes it waits quietly inside an evidence envelope. Sometimes it waits inside a laboratory freezer. Sometimes it waits inside a strand of DNA too small for earlier generations of scientists to fully understand. Then one day, science catches up. The silence ends. The evidence speaks. And a mystery that once seemed destined to remain unsolved becomes part of history instead. For more than 30 years, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remained one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting cold cases. Today, they are remembered not only for the tragedy that unfolded in November 1987, but also for what their investigation ultimately proved. That meticulous police work matters. That preserving evidence matters. That scientific progress matters. And that even after decades of unanswered questions, the pursuit of truth can still prevail. The killer believed time would protect his secret. Time did something else. It preserved the evidence that ultimately exposed it.